Shalom, this is Yair Davidiy from Brit-Am. We research the whereabouts of the Lost End tribes. We find the Lost End tribes to be amongst the Western nations. That is what we do. That is what we consider our task in this world, to bring knowledge as to the whereabouts of where the Lost End tribes of Israel are to be found. And that is what we concentrate upon. So happens that here and there we have to deal with other matters that are complementary to this. So one of these is evolution, the subject of evolution, of creation, of science, of DNA, because all of these involve the story of the Bible. Also DNA has something to say concerning the races of the world. When we deal with races, we find that the ancient Hebrews belonged to one group. They had the same forefathers, but they separated, and according to our understanding, one portion of them went to the west, another portion remained in the Middle East, and they became the ancestors of the Jewish people, whereas those who went to the west became a part of Western civilization, a part of the Western peoples, and they are the same as them genetically, physically, and they are quite different from the Jewish people in many ways. Even though there are similarities under the surface, superficially there's a certain difference between them that needs to be explained. So we have to go into DNA, explain DNA, and see what happened in order to find our feet in the modern world, in the face of modern science. Because people are attuned, people know what is going on, people read up, they read up on DNA, they read articles, they see in the media, they see discussions of DNA. Sometimes they themselves take DNA tests. They're not that expensive these days, and they're quite interesting. One of my sons also took one, and it was quite interesting what he found. So this is a common phenomenon. So we have to know something about it, and we have to be able to answer questions to it. And when there are apparent contradictions between our explanations of ancient history and of present-day identifications, racial identifications, ancestral identifications according to the Bible, according to rabbinical sources, according to archaeology, history, and according to DNA, how do we bring everything together? So this too comes into play. This also brings us back to creationism, the idea of creationism, that is the Bible literally true? Or did a man evolve? And is a man actually billions or millions of years old? Has he been on this earth for millions and millions of years? And did he come from a great many people? And what exactly happened is against the biblical story that says a man was created less than 6,000 years ago, and that everything that we know can fit in the be able to fit into a framework of 6,000 years or so. According to the Bible, God created man, or God completed the creation of the world as we know it. Man came into existence about 6,000 years ago. About 6,000 years ago, close to 3,760 BCE, that is before the Common Era. That we use the term Common Era because that is acceptable to religious Jews and to everyone else. At all events, the commonly accepted chronology is found in a Midrash Seder Olam, which Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta was the author of. There are other Midrashim or other similar works that give slightly different dates, but that is the one we rely upon. A Midrash, incidentally, is a work that was authored by one of the teachers, one of the rabbis quoted in the Talmud, or someone of equal standard from around about the same time period. We do not have to accept the Midrashic, what the Midrash says. It's not necessarily to be taken literally. Midrashim, different Midrashim contradict each other. Sometimes they're more there for the educational value and not to be taken literally. And at all events they should be respected, and we do. We meet them, we respect them all. The Bible says that the earth was created in 7 days or even 6 days, because on the Sabbath day God did not work. And there are Midrashic sources that say each day of creation lasted for an extremely long period of time. Even the Psalms Psalms chapter 90 verse 4 says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night." So, and since the days mentioned in the Bible existed, began to come into effect before the sun did, so we may take the day to mean periods of time. That's okay, no problem. Also, it doesn't really matter whether there was evolution or wasn't evolution. The first man, as we know him, came into existence about 3,760 BCE. So they still can fit into a time scale, can be accepted. And Nachmanides also said that the 6 days of creation may actually have encompassed a vast amount of time, and others say differently, take it much more literally. For as far as we're concerned, it doesn't really matter. But we do hold that man is not that old. That the history of humanity should be condensed to less than 6,000 years before our time. Dr. Gerald Schroeder is a learned Jew, a religious Jew, and a scientist, and he accepts the evolution. There's books on it, attempting to reconcile modern scientific accounts of how the Earth came into being, and evolution and so on, with the biblical accounts, or with Jewish religious sources. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, 1865-1935, was a great rabbi. We sometimes quote from him, use him as a source on other points. And he saw evolution, the theory of evolution, as having a value, possibly having value, and there have been others like him. On the other hand, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who were against evolution. Rabbi Avigdor Miller, he was an American rabbi, Haredi rabbi, ultra-Orthodox rabbi, and he wrote books against evolution, interesting books, very strongly worded books, convincing works, and his style also, the material he used, or part of it, was very similar to that used by American fundamentalists in creationist works. There's also Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Rabbi of Lubavitch, the Rabbi of Chabad. He's a very great rabbi, a widely respected rabbi. He still is widely respected. He was extremely opposed to evolution. He wrote against it from a religious, philosophical point of view, and his followers still take that position. On the other hand, you have, as we said, you have modern Orthodox rabbis who take a more liberal view of what happened, and as far as we're concerned, it doesn't really matter. We use one book of interest is Mysteries of the Creation, a cosmology derived from Tanakh and Chazal, Rabbi David Brown, printed in Israel in 1997, and he explains the creation, the flood, biblical history, and so on, within the framework of the biblical timeline, using what is known as catastrophism. That is a series of catastrophes, similar to that of found in the books of Emanuel Velikovsky, and he in effect explains everything within the framework of the biblical timeline. And there are others. So Rabbi Yossi Mizrahi has talks on this, and is on this matter. He speaks against evolution, so do other rabbis. But if you whatever you want, you can find. You want to find a modern Orthodox rabbi who supports evolution and gives rational explanations of how he reconciles them with the simple word of the Bible, you can find them. You want to find someone who's against evolution, you can find them. They're all there, and they all have something to say, and they're all worth taking into account. Our personal view is that the Bible is true. The Bible things happened as the Bible says. The bottom line is that man has not been on this earth for that long. and that everything we understand, all human history, can and should be seen within the framework of the timeline of the time scale given by the Bible. This also we have the question. Also have the question of DNA. How do we reconcile DNA findings? How do we reconcile DNA findings with the Bible? So one person who has addressed this subject is Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He explains DNA findings within a biblical time framework. He's an Orthodox. He is a fundamental Christian, a religious Christian, and he sees everything through Christian values. There's another point that we should mention, that there are two ways of looking at reality. There's what is known as the Aristotelian approach, and the Ptolemaic approach. Both of these terms are taken from Greek philosophy. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, so was Ptolemy, and they represent different approaches to reality. Aristotle was logical. His descriptions are linear, A, B, C, and logical. And that is one way of looking at everything. That is how people looked at things in the past. The other approach is that of Ptolemy, associated with Ptolemy, also associated with the English philosopher John Locke, 1603-1704. John Locke was a religious person. He was an English philosopher, and in his work he frequently quotes the Old Testament, and he was a great man in his own right. Wrote on several subjects, and he's known for emphasizing the importance of the unexpected. Don't take things for granted. Things happen in the past. Things occur that you will not expect them, in ways that you will not expect them to happen. And this also applies to the natural world. We should also realize that the sudden, unexpectable occurrences take place. Existence is dynamic. Things can change. And that is also the approach of Brit-Am. We combine the two approaches, so logical linear appreciation, also that of the unexpected, of having things, catastrophes or things coming in, influences coming in from outside, that also affect the flow of history. Should mention that as concerning DNA conventionally, according to DNA, man has existed on the earth for more than 200,000 years. We say 6,000 years, DNA says 200,000. But DNA themselves admit there are a lot of things that they do not take into account or do not realize. For instance, it's admitted that DNA can be influenced by the sun, movements of the sun, by radiation, by the climate. A single village in Africa contains more DNA than the whole of Europe, and within Africa, a single village of the Sand people, that is the Bushmen in southern Africa, they contains more DNA than the rest of the world put together. So it's in the climate, heat, and other factors influence DNA changes. There's no rational, universal rate of change, even though the scientists will say that there is. Now, Dr. Jeanson, he approaches conventional DNA, and he says that they use a clock. That is a clock of mutations, that DNA causes changes from one, causes changes within that changes occur within DNA, and they occur at a more or less set rate, and the conventional or mainstream scientists use old, inferior DNA. Why? Because that gives them the results they want. That gives them the results within the time scale of 200,000 plus years that they want to see things within. It's much easier for them that way. The more time they have, the more, or give themselves the more leeway they have to explain things. Whereas he says more superior DNA in a better state of existence, gives a much quicker rate of change, which lessens the time scale of DNA history and brings it down to within a time scale for women, mitochondrial DNA of 6,000 years, and for men within a time scale of 4,500 years ago, which was the time of the flood, and all men today are descended from people who survived the flood at the time of Noah. And so this is acceptable. So I think that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson is correct, and he has much to contribute, and that this opinion on this matter should be considered, taken into account. But he also talks about other things and extrapolates and other concerning world history and other matters, and how people change from one race to another and so on. And he uses his clock, his revised time scale, to compare it to modern history, to compare to what has happened as we know. And he draws conclusions. So on that matter, we think he is mistaken. And we'll speak on that at another time. At all events, it would seem that DNA changes do occur within a much shorter time than conventional scientists say they do. That they can or could theoretically be fit into the framework as compatible with that of the Bible. And that all mankind are descended from one ancestor. We also understand that changes within DNA occur not according to how they are described. That not all the changes, not all the relationships, the interrelationships of one race being related to another, having been derived from another or similar to another or part of another, that these logical conclusions are mistaken, because it didn't work that way. It only worked that way to a certain degree. It worked that way to a certain degree and went on working that way for a certain degree, and then it changed and changes were introduced. In other words, we have the unexpected the unexpected occurring, as if to say the intervention of divine providence, ongoing divine providence also within DNA. And this also resulted in changes in the racial composition of people. And we will discuss this in future talks. Thank you.